Okay, we're going to try chapter 2, or number 2. So last we heard that James was not even allowed to climb over the fence without fear of being shoved in the cellar with rats. The garden, which covered the whole of the top of the hill, was large and desolate, and the only tree in the entire place was an ancient peach tree that never gave any peaches. There was no swing, no seesaw, no sand pit. No other children were ever invited to come up the hill to play with poor James. There wasn't so much as a dog or a cat around to keep him any company, and as time went on, he became sadder and sadder. He used to spend hours every day standing at the bottom of the garden, gazing wistfully at the lovely but forbidden world of woods and fields and ocean that was spread out below him like a magic carpet. After James Henry Trotter had been living with his aunts for 3 whole years, there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened. This thing, which I say was only rather peculiar, soon caused a second thing to happen, which was very peculiar. And then the very, very peculiar thing caused a fantastically peculiar thing to occur. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of summer. Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and James were all out in the garden. James had been put to work as usual. This time he was chopping wood for the kitchen stove, and Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were sitting comfortably in deck chairs, sipping tall glasses of fizzy lemonade and watching him do all the work. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. She had small piggy eyes and one of those white flabby faces that looked exactly as though it had been boiled. She was like a great white, soggy, overboiled cabbage. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed onto the end of her nose with a clip. She had a screeching voice and long, wet, narrow lips, and whenever she got angry or excited, little flecks of spit would come shooting out of her mouth as she talked. And there they sat, these 2 ghastly hags, sipping their drinks and every now and then screaming at James to chop faster, chop faster. You see those 2 ladies? They also talked about themselves, each one saying how beautiful she thought she was. Aunt Sponge had a long-handled mirror on her lap, and she kept picking it up and gazing at her own hideous face. "I look and smell as lovely as a rose. Just feast your eyes upon my face. Observe my shapely nose. Behold my heavenly silky locks. And if I take off both my socks, you'll see my dainty toes. But don't forget how much your tummy shows." Aunt Sponge went red. Aunt Spiker said, "My sweet, you cannot win. Behold my gorgeous curvy shape, my teeth, my charming grin. Oh, beauteous me, how I adore my radiant looks, and please ignore the pimple on my chin. My dear old trout, you're only bones and skin." Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping wood and chopping wood. The heat was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arm was aching. The chopper was a large, blunt thing, far too heavy for a small boy to use, and it wasn't really sharp. As he worked, James began thinking about all the other children in the world and what they might be doing. Some might be riding bicycles, some would be walking in the woods, picking wildflowers, playing with friends, splashing on the beach. Tears began oozing out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed by his own unhappiness. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her spectacles. James began to cry. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast." "Oh, Aunt Sponge," James cried. "Auntie Spiker, couldn't we all please, just for once, go to the seaside? It isn't very far." "Why, you lazy good-for-nothing!" "Beat him!" cried Aunt Sponge. "I certainly will!" Aunt Spiker snapped. She glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. "I shall beat you later on in the day, when I don't feel so hot. So now get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm." James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could to the far end of the garden and hid himself behind that clump of dirty old laurel bushes. Then he covered his face with his hands and began to cry and cry. It was at this point that the first thing of all, the rather peculiar thing that led to so many other peculiar things, happened. Suddenly, just behind James, heard a rustling of leaves. He turned around and saw an old man in a crazy dark green suit. Coming out of the bushes, he had a huge bald head and a face that was covered with whiskers. He stopped when he was close to James and stood there leaning on his stick. "Come closer to me, little boy. Come right up close to me, and I will show you something wonderful." James was too frightened to move. The old man hobbled up a step or two nearer, and then he put his hand into the pocket of his jacket and took out a small paper bag. Can you see it? "You see this?" he whispered. "You know what this is? You know what's inside this little bag?" Then he came nearer, leaning forward and pushing his face so close to James that James could feel blowing hot breath on his cheeks. "Take a look, my dear," he said, opening the bag. Inside it, James could see a mass of tiny green things that looked like little stones or crystals. They were extraordinarily beautiful, and there was a strange brightness about them. "Listen to them," the old man said. "Listen to them move." James stared into the bag, and sure enough, there was a faint rustling sound coming up from inside it. And then he noticed that all the thousands of little green things were slowly, very slowly, stirring about and moving over each other as though they were alive. "There's more power and magic in those things than in all the rest of the world put together," the old man said softly. But what are they?" James asked him. "Where do they come from?" "Aha!" the old man whispered. "You'd never guess." Suddenly, he jumped back and began waving his stick madly in the air. "Crocodile tongues!" he cried. 1,000 long, slimy crocodile tongues, boiled up in the skull of a dead witch for 20 days and nights, with the eyeball of a lizard. Add the fingers of a monkey, a pig, the beak of a parrot, the juice of a porcupine, and 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Stew for a week, and then let the moon do the rest. All at once, he pushed the white paper bag into James's hand and said, "Here, you take it. It's yours." James Henry Trotter stood there clutching the bag and staring at the old man. "And now," the old man said, "all you've got to do is take a large jug of water, pour all the little green things into it, then slowly, one by one, add 10 hairs from your own head. In a couple of minutes, the water will begin to froth and bubble furiously. As soon as that happens, you must quickly drink it all down, the whole jugful. Then you will feel it churning and boiling in your stomach. After that, marvelous things will start happening to you, and you will never be miserable again. Because you are miserable, aren't you? You needn't tell me. I know all about it. Now off you go. Do exactly as I say, and don't whisper a word of this to those 2 horrible ants. Not a word. And don't let those green things in there get away from you either. If they do escape, then they will be working their magic on somebody else. And that isn't what you want at all, is it? Whoever they meet first, that will be the one who gets the full power of the magic. So hold the bag tight. Don't tear the paper. Off you go. Hurry up. Don't wait. Now's the time." And with that, the old man turned away and disappeared into the bushes. We'll read more next time. I love you, Hank. Night, night.